The baking process, turning sand into substance. The actual bread-making process was an adventure in primitive technology that would challenge even the most skilled modern baker. There were no commercial yeast packets, no precise measurements, no temperature controls, and certainly no stand mixers or bread machines. Leavening was achieved through wild yeasts captured from the environment or maintained in sourdough starters that were passed down through generations. These starters were precious family possessions, carefully maintained and protected, because losing your starter meant weeks of eating unleavened flatbread while you developed a new one. The dough was mixed in large pottery bowls using whatever water was available, usually the same questionable Nile water you'd used for bathing. The consistency was difficult to control because Egyptian flour varied wildly in texture and absorption properties, depending on the grain quality and grinding conditions. Baking was done in outdoor ovens that were essentially beehive-shaped mud structures with fires built inside them. The process required careful timing and constant attention. First, a fire was built inside the oven and allowed to burn until the walls were heated through. Then the ashes and coals were raked out, and the bread was quickly inserted into the residual heat. This method produced uneven results at best. Parts of the loaf might be charred while other sections remained undercooked. The bread often picked up ash, sand, and other debris from the oven floor. Temperature control was impossible, so baking was as much art as science, requiring years of experience to master. The texture and taste experienced the finished product was bread that bore little resemblance to anything a modern person would recognize. As such, Egyptian bread was dense, heavy, and incredibly coarse. The texture was gritty from stone particles and sand contamination. The crust was thick and often charred in places, while the interior could be gummy and undercooked. The taste was bland at best, bitter at worst. There were no seasonings, no herbs, and certainly no sugar or sweeteners. The natural flavor of the grain was often overwhelmed by the taste of smoke, ash, and whatever other contaminants had found their way into the bread during the baking process. Eating this bread was a challenge in itself. It was tough enough to require serious chewing, and the stone particles made every bite a potential dental hazard. People often had to soak their bread in water, beer, or whatever other liquid was available just to make it soft enough to chew without breaking their teeth. Despite its many shortcomings, this bread was absolutely essential for survival. It provided the bulk of the calories that most ancient Egyptians consumed, along with whatever nutrients could be extracted from the heavily processed grain. For many people, bread constituted 70 to 80% of their total caloric intake. The social hierarchy of bread. Not all bread was created equal in ancient Egypt. The quality of your bread was a direct indicator of your social status, and the differences were stark enough to make the bread itself a form of social currency. The pharaoh and the highest nobility ate bread made from the finest flour, carefully sifted to remove most impurities and stone particles. This bread was made by skilled bakers, using the best ingredients available, baked in well-maintained ovens, and served fresh. It was still primitive by modern standards, but it was the pinnacle of Egyptian baking technology. The middle class's skilled craftsmen, scribes, and lower-level officials had access to moderately refined flour and somewhat better baking facilities. Their bread was still coarse and gritty, but it was edible without requiring extensive soaking or special preparation. The poor, which again was the vast majority of the population, ate bread made from the coarsest flour, often mixed with cheaper grains like barley or even ground legumes to stretch the wheat supply. This bread was so rough that it was barely edible, often requiring extensive soaking in liquid before it could be consumed. Workers on major construction projects like pyramids were sometimes paid partially in bread rations. The quality and quantity of these rations were carefully regulated, with different types of workers receiving different grades of bread based on their skill level and importance to the project. Beer. The liquid bread revolution. Here's where ancient Egyptian cuisine gets interesting. Beer wasn't just an alcoholic beverage, it was a dietary staple, a form of liquid nutrition that was often safer to drink than water and provided essential calories and nutrients that bread alone couldn't supply. Egyptian beer was nothing like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and nutritious, more like a liquid porridge than a clear alcoholic beverage. The alcohol content was relatively low, typically around 2 to 4%, just enough to kill harmful bacteria and make the beverage safe to drink, but not enough to cause serious intoxication during normal consumption. The brewing process was closely related to bread making. In fact, partially baked bread was often used as a base for beer production. The bread was broken up, mixed with water, and allowed to ferment using wild yeasts or maintained yeast cultures. The result was a thick, chunky beverage that provided both calories and liquid nutrition. Beer was consumed by everyone, including children, because it was often the safest available beverage. The fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria and parasites that made water dangerous to drink. Even children regularly consumed weak beer as their primary source of hydration. Different qualities of beer existed to match the social hierarchy. The wealthy drank beer made from the finest ingredients, carefully brewed and filtered. The poor drank thick, gritty beer that was barely more than fermented bread soup. But everyone drank beer, making it one of the few democratizing elements of ancient Egyptian society. The vegetable situation. When plants fight back while bread and beer formed the foundation of the ancient Egyptian diet, vegetables played an important supplementary role, though the vegetables available were limited, often tough, and required significant preparation to become edible. Onions were a dietary staple, partly because they could be grown easily in Egypt's clifford and partly because they stored relatively well. But these weren't the sweet, mild onions you might find in a modern grocery store. Ancient Egyptian onions were strong, pungent, and often small and tough. They were usually eaten raw or quickly cooked, adding some flavor and nutrition to an otherwise bland diet. Garlic was also common and highly valued for both culinary and medicinal purposes. Ancient Egyptians believed garlic had protective properties against disease and evil spirits. Workers on major construction projects were often given garlic rations to maintain their health and strength. Like onions, ancient garlic was much stronger and more pungent than modern varieties. Leeks provided another source of nutrition and flavor. They grew well in Egypt's climate and could be harvested throughout much of the year. Leeks were often cooked in stews or eaten raw, providing essential vitamins and minerals that were otherwise lacking in the grain-heavy Egyptian diet. Lettuce was grown and eaten, though ancient Egyptian lettuce was quite different from modern varieties. It was more bitter, had a stronger flavor, and was believed to have aphrodisiac properties. Lettuce was associated with the god Min and played a role in certain religious ceremonies. Cucumbers and melons provided precious water content, along with some nutrition. In Egypt's hot climate, these water-rich foods were essential for maintaining hydration. They were often eaten fresh when available, though they didn't store well and were seasonal luxuries for most people. Protein. The luxury of the lucky protein was the most challenging part of the ancient Egyptian diet to obtain. For the majority of the population, meat was a rare luxury consumed only on special occasions or during religious festivals. Most people had to make do with whatever protein sources they could catch, trade for, or afford. Fish from the Nile provided the most accessible protein for many Egyptians. However, fishing was dangerous due to crocodiles and hippos, and the quality of fish varied dramatically depending on where it was caught and how fresh it was. Fish had to be eaten quickly in Egypt's hot climate, or preserved through drying or salting processes that often made the fish tough, salty, and barely palatable. The fishing process itself was an adventure. Fishermen used simple nets, hooks, and spears to catch fish, but they had to constantly watch for predators. Crocodiles were attracted to the splashing and struggling of caught fish, and many fishermen were killed or injured by crocodiles attacking their boats. Different types of fish were available depending on the season and location. Catfish were common but considered somewhat undesirable. Perch and other smaller fish were easier to catch, but provided limited nutrition. Larger fish, like the Nile perch, were prized but difficult and dangerous to catch. Poultry was somewhat more accessible than red meat. Ducks and geese lived along the Nile and could be hunted with simple traps and nets. Chickens weren't introduced to Egypt until much later in its history, so most poultry came from wild birds. However, hunting birds required skill and equipment that many people couldn't afford. Domesticated fowl were kept by some families, but maintaining poultry required resources that most people lacked. Birds needed protection from predators, regular feeding, and suitable housing. For most families, keeping poultry was economically impractical. Eggs, when available, were highly prized. However, they were often small, and storage was problematic in Egypt's hot climate. Eggs had to be consumed quickly or preserved through various techniques that often made them less palatable. Beef and lamb, food of the gods and pharaoh's red meat, was the ultimate luxury in ancient Egypt, reserved primarily for the wealthy, the priestly class, and special religious occasions. Cattle were incredibly valuable animals that provided milk, labor, and eventually meat, but they were far too precious to slaughter casually. The cattle that did exist in ancient Egypt were generally smaller and tougher than modern breeds. They had to be hardy enough to survive Egypt's climate and capable of working in agricultural settings. This meant the meat, when it was available, was often tough and required extensive cooking to become edible. Sheep and goats were somewhat more common than cattle but still represented significant investments. These animals provided milk, wool or hair, and eventually meat, but they were typically slaughtered only when they were too old to be productive in other ways, or during major religious festivals. The slaughter and preparation of large animals was a community event when it occurred. Because there was no refrigeration, an entire animal had to be consumed quickly once it was killed. This meant that meat consumption typically involved sharing with neighbors and extended family, turning the rare occurrence of meat eating into a social celebration. Religious dietary restrictions also affected meat consumption. Certain animals were considered sacred and couldn't be eaten. Others were considered unclean or inappropriate for human consumption. The complex web of religious beliefs surrounding food meant that even when meat was available, there were often restrictions on who could eat it and under what circumstances. Cooking methods, fighting fire with fire, the actual process of preparing food in ancient Egypt was complicated by the lack of sophisticated cooking equipment and the constant challenge of fuel scarcity. Wood was rare and precious in Egypt's desert environment, so fuel for cooking fires was always a limiting factor. Most cooking was done over small fires, fueled by whatever combustible materials could be found. This might include dried dung from cattle or other animals, dried reeds and papyrus, or small amounts of precious wood. The fires were typically small and had to be carefully managed to conserve fuel while still providing enough heat for cooking. Cooking vessels were simple pottery containers that could crack or break from the thermal stress of cooking fires. A broken cooking pot was a serious household disaster because pottery was expensive and couldn't be easily replaced. Most families owned only a few cooking vessels and had to plan their meal preparation carefully around the limitations of their equipment. Boiling was the most common cooking method when liquid was available, but it required both fuel for fire and precious water. Many foods were simply roasted over open flames or baked in the coals of cooking fires. This produced unevenly cooked food that was often charred on the outside and undercooked on the inside. Stewing was possible when ingredients and fuel were available, but it required long cooking times and careful fire management. Most stews were simple combinations of whatever vegetables were available, occasionally supplemented with small amounts of meat or fish. Seasoning was extremely limited. Salt was available but expensive. Most flavor came from onions, garlic, and whatever wild herbs could be gathered. The result was food that was often bland and monotonous, with little variation from day to day or season to season. Food storage, racing against time and pests. Storing food in ancient Egypt's hot, humid climate was a constant battle against spoilage, pests, and theft. Without refrigeration or effective preservatives, most food had to be consumed quickly after preparation or it would become inedible and potentially dangerous. Grain storage was the most critical food preservation challenge. Wheat and barley had to be protected from moisture, which could cause rapid spoilage and mold growth. They also had to be protected from insects, rodents, and other pests that could consume or contaminate entire food supplies. Most grain was stored in large pottery jars sealed with clay lids and sometimes lined with pitch or other waterproofing materials. These storage jars were buried partially underground to take advantage of the Earth's cooling and stabilizing temperature. However, the jars were still vulnerable to cracking, pest infiltration, and moisture problems. Bread had to be consumed within a day or two of baking or it would become inedibly hard or start to mold. Most families baked small amounts of bread frequently rather than trying to store large quantities. This meant that someone had to spend time grinding grain and baking bread almost every day. Vegetables were often dried to extend their storage life. Onions could be braided and hung in dry areas. Other vegetables were cut into strips and dried in the sun, though this process had to be carefully managed to prevent spoilage before dehydration was complete. Fish and meat were preserved through drying, salting, or smoking when these options were available. However, the preservation process often made the food tough, salty, and less nutritious. Preserved foods were typically used as emergency rations rather than preferred dietary options. The economics of eating food in ancient Egypt wasn't just about nutrition. It was economics, politics, and social status all rolled into one. The vast majority of most families' resources went toward obtaining basic food supplies, and food shortages could quickly become life-threatening situations. Most people worked primarily to earn enough to eat. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers typically received payment in the form of food rations rather than money. These rations were carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain working capability without wasting valuable resources. The annual Nile flood determined food availability for the entire year. Good floods meant abundant harvests and relative food security. Poor floods meant famine, starvation, and social upheaval. The unpredictability of the flood meant that food security was never guaranteed. Even for the wealthy, food hoarding by the wealthy and powerful was common. During times of scarcity, those who could afford to store large quantities of grain often profited enormously during famines by selling food at inflated prices. This created a system where food crises disproportionately affected the poor while benefiting the rich. Trade played an important role in food security. Egypt imported various foods from neighboring regions when possible, but this trade was expensive and unreliable. Wars, political instability, and transportation challenges could quickly disrupt food imports, leaving Egypt dependent on its own agricultural production. Seasonal eating. The flood cycle. Dietha, ancient Egyptian diet, was dominated by the annual cycle of the Nile flood, which determined not just what foods were available, but when they could be grown, harvested, and consumed. This created a yearly pattern of feast and famine that shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. During the flood season, roughly July through October, much of Egypt's agricultural land was underwater. This was actually a time of relative plenty for those who had stored food from the previous harvest, but it was also a time when fresh vegetables and grains weren't available. People relied heavily on stored grains, preserved foods, and whatever could be gathered from areas not affected by flooding. The growing season, roughly October through February, was when new crops were planted and began to grow. This was often the leanest time of year, when stored food from the previous harvest was running low, but new crops weren't yet ready to harvest. Many people experienced significant weight loss and nutritional stress during this period. The harvest season, roughly February through July, was the time of greatest food abundance. Fresh grains, vegetables, and fruits became available. This was when most people regained weight lost during the lean months, and when food was most varied and nutritious. However, this was also the most labor-intensive time of year, requiring enormous amounts of work to harvest and process crops. This cyclical pattern meant that most ancient Egyptians experienced significant fluctuations in their nutritional status throughout the year. Weight loss during lean months was normal and expected. Chronic malnutrition was common, and many people never fully recovered from the nutritional stresses of poor harvest years. Children and food. Growing up hungry children in ancient Egypt faced particular nutritional challenges that modern people would find shocking. Infant mortality was extremely high, partly due to nutritional factors, and those children who survived often faced chronic malnutrition that affected their physical and mental development. Breastfeeding was the primary source of nutrition for infants, but maternal malnutrition often meant that breast milk was inadequate in quality and quantity. Mothers who were themselves malnourished couldn't produce enough nutritious milk to properly nourish their children. When children were weaned, usually around age 2 or 3, they transitioned to the same basic diet as adults, primarily bread and beer. However, their smaller stomachs and higher nutritional needs per body weight meant that many children couldn't consume enough of these low-nutrition foods to meet their growth requirements. Child labor was common and necessary for family survival, but it also meant that growing children were burning calories through work, while often not receiving adequate nutrition to support both work and growth. This created a cycle where malnourished children became malnourished adults who produced malnourished children. Educational opportunities were limited, partly because children needed to spend most of their time working to help their families obtain food. Even wealthy families prioritized food security over education, and only the most privileged children received formal schooling. The high infant and child mortality rates in ancient Egypt were directly related to nutritional factors. Children who survived to adulthood were often physically stunted and had weakened immune systems that made them vulnerable to diseases throughout their lives. Chapter 4. Work. Until you drop labor in the land of the pharaohs, the dawn of drudgery. As the sun climbs higher in the Egyptian sky and the heat begins its daily transformation from merely uncomfortable to potentially lethal, you face the reality that has defined human existence since the dawn of civilization. You must work to survive. But work in ancient Egypt wasn't the 8-hour-day, air-conditioned office experience that modern people might imagine. It was brutal, dangerous, physically demanding labor performed under conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever conceived. The concept of a weekend didn't exist. The idea of paid vacation time would have been incomprehensible. Workers' compensation, health insurance, and retirement plans were fantasy concepts that wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, you worked until you were too old, too sick, or too injured to continue, and then you hoped your family could support you until you died. Your specific type of work depended largely on the social class you were born into, because social mobility in ancient Egypt was extremely limited. If your father was a farmer, you would almost certainly be a farmer. If your mother was a weaver, you would learn to weave. The idea that you could choose your career based on your interests or talents was a luxury that existed only for the tiny, elite class. Agricultural labor, fighting the desert for every grain. The vast majority of ancient Egyptians, perhaps 80 to 90% of the population, worked in agriculture. This might sound pastoral and peaceful to modern ears, but farming in ancient Egypt was a desperate struggle against hostile environmental conditions that required back-breaking labor and could kill you in numerous creative ways. Egyptian farming was entirely dependent on the annual Nile flood, which deposited fertile silt across the river valley, but also created a compressed growing season where everything had to be accomplished in a few critical months. Missing the optimal planting or harvesting time could mean starvation for your entire family. The farming cycle began during the flood season, when much of the agricultural land was underwater. This was when farmers had to prepare tools, repair irrigation equipment, and maintain the complex system of dikes, canals, and drainage ditches that controlled water flow across the farmland. This work was done while standing in floodwater that was contaminated with animal waste, human sewage, and various parasites and diseases. Once the floodwaters receded, leaving behind a layer of fertile mud, the real race against time began. The soil had to be prepared quickly before it dried out and became too hard to work. This meant using primitive wooden plows, often pulled by oxen if you were wealthy enough to own them, or by human muscle power if you weren't. The plowing process was exhausting work that required long days of physical labor under the increasingly brutal sun. The wooden plows were heavy, awkward, and constantly broke down. Repairs had to be made in the field with whatever materials were available, and there were no replacement parts or service centers to call when equipment failed. Planting had to be done quickly and efficiently to take advantage of the moisture left by the flood. Seeds were scattered by hand over the prepared soil, then covered using various techniques, including driving herds of animals across the fields to trample the seeds into the ground. This created clouds of dust that made breathing difficult and contaminated everything with sand and debris. Irrigation, the life and death, water wars, managing water, was perhaps the most critical and dangerous aspect of agricultural work in ancient Egypt. The elaborate irrigation system that made Egyptian civilization possible required constant maintenance, an operation by people who were working with potentially deadly equipment under extreme conditions. The shaduf, a counterweighted lever system used to lift water from canals to higher-level fields, was the primary irrigation technology. Operating a shaduf required standing at the edge of irrigation channels while repeatedly lifting heavy containers of water, often for 10 to 12 hours per day. Workers regularly fell into the canals and drowned, were attacked by crocodiles, or suffered back injuries from the repetitive heavy lifting. Maintaining irrigation canals required workers to dig in mud and standing water while dealing with various aquatic hazards. Canal maintenance was typically done during the flood season when the water was highest and most dangerous. Workers had to clear blockages, repair erosion damage, and modify water flow patterns while standing waist-deep in water that contained crocodiles, venomous snakes, and various disease-carrying parasites. Water disputes between neighboring farms were common and sometimes violent. Access to irrigation water could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation, so farmers fought fierce battles over water rights. These conflicts sometimes escalated into armed confrontations that left people dead or seriously injured. The timing of irrigation was critical and unforgiving. Water had to be applied to crops at exactly the right times and in the right amounts. Too much water could drown plants or promote fungal diseases. Too little water meant crop failure and famine. The pressure to make correct irrigation decisions was enormous because mistakes could be fatal for entire communities. Harvesting, racing against time and disaster. When crops finally matured, usually during the hottest part of the year, the harvest had to be completed quickly before the grain over-ripened, was destroyed by pests, or was damaged by weather. Harvesting was perhaps the most physically demanding work in the agricultural calendar, requiring long days of intensive labor under brutal sun. Grain was cut using sickles, curved blades attached to wooden handles. These tools were sharp enough to easily cut through grain stalks, but they were also sharp enough to inflict serious injuries on workers who were tired, dehydrated, and working under extreme time pressure. Cuts and lacerations were common, and in Egypt's contaminated environment, even minor wounds could become infected and life-threatening. The harvesting process required workers to bend over constantly while cutting grain close to the ground. This position was maintained for hours at a time under the full force of the Egyptian sun. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were common, and many workers collapsed and died in the fields during harvest season. Once cut, the grain had to be bundled and transported to threshing areas before it could spoil or be consumed by pests. This meant carrying heavy bundles of grain across rough terrain while dealing with extreme heat and dehydration. Workers often had to travel significant distances between harvest areas and processing sites. Adding to the physical demands of the job, threshing involved trampling the harvested grain with cattle or other animals to separate the edible grain from the stalks and chaff. This created enormous clouds of dust and debris that made breathing difficult and covered workers with a mixture of grain dust, animal dander, and various allergens. Many agricultural workers developed chronic respiratory problems from lifetime exposure to threshing dust. Construction work, building monuments with blood and sweat. While most Egyptians worked in agriculture, construction projects, particularly the massive building campaigns of the pharaohs, required enormous numbers of workers and represented some of the most dangerous and demanding labor in the ancient world. Working on projects like pyramids, temples, and royal tombs was essentially a death sentence carried out in slow motion. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most famous construction projects in human history, required an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 workers, laboring for over 20 years. These weren't slaves, as popular mythology suggests, but paid workers who received food rations and basic shelter in exchange for what amounted to killing themselves one stone block at a time. Stone quarrying was perhaps the most dangerous construction. Job. Workers used copper tools and wooden wedges to extract massive limestone and granite blocks from quarries, often working in unstable conditions where cave-ins could kill dozens of people at once. The tools were primitive and constantly broke, requiring workers to improvise repairs or work with damaged equipment. Moving the massive stone blocks required sophisticated engineering but primitive technology. Blocks weighing several tons each had to be moved using only human muscle power, wooden rollers, rope, and inclined planes. The logistics were staggering. Thousands of workers had to coordinate their efforts to move single blocks, and timing errors could result in crushing injuries or death. Construction accidents were routine and often fatal. Workers fell from heights, were crushed by falling stones, or were killed in equipment failures. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and no medical support beyond basic first aid. Injured workers who couldn't continue working were simply replaced. The working conditions on major construction sites were appalling by any standard. Workers lived in crowded, unsanitary barracks where disease spread rapidly. Food rations were often inadequate and of poor quality. Water supplies were limited and frequently contaminated. Workers had to perform heavy physical labor while dealing with malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. Craftsmanship. The elite of the working class, skilled craftsmen, represented the aristocracy of the working class in ancient Egypt. But even these relatively privileged workers faced significant challenges and dangers in their daily work. Stonemasons, carpenters, and other skilled trades required years of training and provided essential services to Egyptian society. But they also dealt with occupational hazards that would horrify modern workers. Metalworking required dealing with extremely high temperatures in an already hot climate. Furnaces for smelting copper and bronze reached temperatures over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, and workers had to maintain these furnaces while standing in the Egyptian sun. Heat-related injuries were common, and workers regularly suffered burns from molten metal or hot tools. The metals available in ancient Egypt were primarily copper and bronze, which required different techniques and temperatures for working. Workers had to understand complex metallurgical processes without the benefit of scientific knowledge about chemistry or materials science. Much of the knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship systems that took years to master. Stone carving required workers to spend long hours hunched over stone blocks, using primitive chisels and hammers to create intricate designs and hieroglyphic inscriptions. The repetitive motion and awkward working positions caused chronic back and joint problems. Stone dust created respiratory issues, and workers regularly suffered eye injuries from flying stone chips. Carpentry work was complicated by the scarcity of good wood in Egypt. Most wood had to be imported from Lebanon or other distant locations, making it expensive and precious. Carpenters had to work with limited materials and couldn't afford to make mistakes. The tools available were basic saws, ADSs, and chisels made from copper or bronze that required constant sharpening and maintenance. Mining and quarrying. Descending into hell, Egypt's wealth was built on mining operations that extracted gold, copper, and precious stones from mines and quarries throughout the country and in conquered territories. These operations required workers to labor under conditions that were dangerous even by ancient Egyptian standards. Gold mining in the eastern desert required workers to travel far, from the Nile into some of the most hostile territory on Earth. The mines were located in areas where temperatures could exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce, and the nearest civilization was hundreds of miles away. Workers lived in primitive camps with minimal shelter and basic food rations. The mining process itself was primitive and dangerous. Workers used fire-setting techniques to crack rock faces, then extracted or using simple tools. The underground workings were unstable and prone to collapse. Ventilation was poor, and workers regularly suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning from fires used in the mining process. Copper mining required similar techniques, but often involved working in narrow, confined spaces underground. Mine shafts were dug by hand using primitive tools, and workers had to crawl through tight passages to reach ore deposits. Cave-ins were common and usually fatal. The transportation of mined materials back to civilization was another major challenge. Heavy loads of ore had to be carried across desert terrain by workers who were already weakened by the mining work itself. Many workers died during the journey back to the Nile Valley. Working conditions in mines were so harsh that mining was often used as punishment for criminals and prisoners of war. The life expectancy of mine workers was measured in months rather than years, and most never returned to their families. Textile production. The hidden industrial revolution. Textile production in ancient Egypt was a major industry that employed thousands of workers, primarily women, in what amounted to the world's first industrial manufacturing system. Linen production from flax cultivation through finished cloth required complex processes and skilled workers, but it also involved repetitive, physically demanding labor under difficult conditions. Flax cultivation required careful timing and intensive labor. The plants had to be harvested at exactly the right stage of maturity to produce the best fiber, and the harvesting process was time-sensitive and physically demanding. Workers had to pull flax plants up by the roots rather than cutting them to preserve the full length of the fibers. The retting process, where harvested flax was soaked in water to rot away the plant material and leave the fibers, created terrible working conditions. The retting pools produced nauseating odors and attracted clouds of insects. Workers had to handle the rotting plant material regularly, exposing themselves to various diseases and infections. Spinning flax fibers into thread was work that required skill and constant attention. Women typically did this work while also managing household responsibilities and childcare. The work required good eyesight and steady hands, and many women developed vision problems and repetitive stress injuries from years of spinning. Weaving linen cloth required large, complex looms that took up significant space and represented major investments for families or workshops. The weaving process was slow and required constant attention to maintain consistent quality. Mistakes in weaving could ruin large amounts of expensive thread and represent. The finishing processes for linen cloth involved bleaching, fulling, and other treatments that exposed workers to harsh chemicals and difficult working conditions. Cloth had to be bleached in the sun while being repeatedly wetted and dried, requiring workers to spend long hours in direct sunlight handling wet textiles. Transportation and trade. Moving the world by muscle power. Egypt's economy depended on transportation systems that moved goods, people, and materials across vast distances using only human and animal power. Workers in transportation trades faced unique challenges that combined the dangers of travel with the physical demands of heavy labor. River transport on the Nile was the backbone of Egyptian commerce, but working on boats and barges was dangerous and demanding work. Sailors had to navigate a river system filled with crocodiles, hippos, and unpredictable currents while managing heavy cargo and primitive sailing equipment. The boats themselves were constructed using techniques that would be considered primitive and unsafe by modern standards. Papyrus boats were light and maneuverable, but fragile and prone to taking on water. Wooden boats were stronger but expensive and difficult to maintain in Egypt's climate. Loading and unloading. Cargo required teams of workers to handle heavy materials. Without modern equipment, stone blocks, grain jars, and other cargo had to be moved using only rope, wooden levers, and human muscle power. Accidents were common, and workers were regularly crushed or injured by shifting cargo. Desert transport required caravans of workers and animals to move goods across hostile terrain where water was scarce and temperatures were extreme. Caravan workers faced dehydration, heat exhaustion, and attacks by desert nomads or wild animals. Many caravan expeditions lost significant numbers of workers to the harsh conditions. The logistics of organizing large transport operations were staggering. Hundreds of workers had to be coordinated, supplied with food and water, and managed across journeys that could last weeks or months. Communication was limited to what could be conveyed by human messengers, and coordination failures could result in the loss of entire expeditions. Domestic service, slavery in all but name wealthy. Egyptian households employed large numbers of domestic servants who performed the countless tasks required to maintain comfortable living conditions for the elite. While these workers weren't technically slaves, their working conditions and lack of personal freedom made their lives barely distinguishable from slavery. Domestic servants worked extremely long hours with no days off and minimal personal time. They were expected to be available to their employers at all hours and could be punished severely for any perceived failures in their duties. The work was physically demanding and required servants to maintain standards of cleanliness and service that were difficult to achieve with primitive tools and techniques. Kitchen work in wealthy households required servants to prepare elaborate meals using basic cooking equipment while maintaining food safety standards in Egypt's hot climate. Food preparation was time-consuming and labor-intensive, requiring servants to grind grain, prepare ingredients, tend cooking fires, and clean up after meals without modern conveniences. Cleaning and maintenance work required servants to keep large households spotless using only basic tools and cleaning agents. Floors had to be swept and mopped daily, furnishings had to be dusted and maintained, and textiles had to be washed and cared for using primitive techniques. Personal service for wealthy employers required servants to help with bathing, dressing, and grooming while maintaining absolute discretion about their employers' private lives. Servants who failed to maintain proper deference or who revealed household secrets could be severely punished or dismissed without references. Military service. Fighting and dying for Pharaoh. Military service in ancient Egypt involved both professional soldiers and conscripted civilians who were required to serve in the Pharaoh's armies. During times of war or major military campaigns, military service was dangerous, poorly compensated, and often resulted in death or permanent disability. Egyptian armies were primarily infantry forces equipped with basic weapons like spears, bows, and simple swords. Soldiers had to provide much of their own equipment and were responsible for maintaining their weapons and gear throughout long campaigns. The weapons were primitive by modern standards and required significant skill and training to use effectively. Military campaigns often took soldiers far from Egypt into hostile territory, where they faced not only enemy armies but also disease, starvation, and extreme weather conditions. Supply lines were unreliable, and soldiers often had to forage for food and water while dealing with combat stress and the constant threat of death. Combat itself was brutal and personal. Ancient warfare involved hand-to-hand fighting with primitive weapons that caused horrific injuries. Medical care for wounded soldiers was basic at best, and many died from infections or complications from wounds that would be easily treatable. Today, military discipline was harsh, and soldiers who failed to perform their duties or who showed cowardice could be executed or severely punished. The command structure was rigid, and common soldiers had no voice in military decisions that could determine whether they lived or died. Occupational hazards. The daily dance with death. Every occupation in ancient Egypt involved risks that would be considered unacceptable in any modern workplace. The combination of primitive technology, extreme environmental conditions, and lack of safety regulations created a work environment where serious injury or death was a constant possibility. Heat-related illnesses were common across all occupations that required outdoor work. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and dehydration killed workers regularly, especially during the summer months when temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Workers had to learn to recognize the early signs of heat illness and take breaks when possible, but the pressure to maintain productivity often prevented adequate rest. Injuries from tools and equipment were routine because most tools were sharp, heavy, and difficult to control. Workers regularly suffered cuts, puncture wounds, and crushing injuries from primitive tools and machinery. The lack of medical care meant that even minor injuries could become infected and life-threatening. Respiratory diseases were common among workers who were exposed to dust, smoke, and other airborne contaminants. Miners, metal workers, and agricultural workers often developed chronic breathing problems that reduced their life expectancy and work capacity. The connection between occupational exposures and health problems wasn't understood, so workers continued to be exposed to harmful substances throughout their careers. Repetitive stress injuries affected workers in many occupations that required repetitive motions or awkward working positions. Scribes developed hand and wrist problems from constant writing. Weavers suffered from back and neck problems from hunching over looms. Agricultural workers developed joint problems from repetitive harvesting motions. The economics of labor. Working to survive. The relationship between work and survival in ancient Egypt was direct and unforgiving. Most workers were paid in food rations rather than money, and the amount of food they received was carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain their work capacity without wasting valuable resources. Payment systems varied, depending on the type of work and the worker's skill level. Skilled craftsmen might receive better rations and occasional bonuses of clothing or other goods. Unskilled laborers typically received only basic food rations that provided minimal nutrition and little variety. The quality of food rations also varied based on the worker's status and the availability of supplies. During good years, when harvests were abundant, workers might receive adequate nutrition. During poor years or famines, rations were reduced to starvation levels, and workers had to supplement their income through other means or face malnutrition. Many workers had to maintain small gardens or engage in secondary occupations to supplement their primary income. This meant working even longer hours and taking on additional risks to ensure adequate food supplies for their families. The pressure to earn enough to survive left little time for rest, leisure, or family life. Work-related social structure. The type of work you performed determined not only your income but also your social status and opportunities for advancement. Egyptian society was highly stratified, and occupational categories were clearly defined with limited mobility between them. Skilled craftsmen, scribes, and other specialized workers formed the middle class of Egyptian society. They had better working conditions than laborers, received higher compensation, and had opportunities to advance within their chosen fields. However, they were still subject to the demands of their employers and had limited personal freedom. Unskilled laborers formed the bottom of the social hierarchy and had few opportunities for advancement. Their work was physically demanding, poorly compensated, and offered little security. Most laborers remained in the same occupational category throughout their lives and passed their low status on to their children. The professional military class occupied a unique position in Egyptian society. Successful soldiers could achieve higher status and better compensation through military service, but they also faced significant risks and had to be willing to spend long periods away from their families. Gender and work roles in ancient Egypt were heavily influenced by gender, with men and women typically performing different types of labor. However, the division wasn't as rigid as in some other ancient civilizations, and women could engage in various occupations and even achieve positions of some authority. Women were primarily responsible for domestic work, textile production, and certain types of agricultural labor. They managed households, raised children, and performed much of the food preparation and preservation work that kept families fed. This work was essential but often undervalued and poorly compensated. Some women worked in specialized occupations like midwifery, weaving, or religious service. These roles required specific skills and training and could provide better compensation and social status than general domestic work. However, opportunities for women in specialized occupations were limited. Women from wealthy families might oversee large households and manage significant economic resources, but they were still subject to male authority and had limited legal rights. Even women in positions of relative power were constrained by social expectations and legal limitations. Child labor. Growing up, working children in ancient Egypt began working at early ages out of economic necessity. Families couldn't afford to support non-productive members, so children were expected to contribute to household income as soon as they were physically capable of performing useful work. Young children typically started with simple tasks like tending animals, gathering fuel, or helping with food preparation. As they grew older and stronger, they took on more demanding work and gradually learned the skills they would need as adults. This apprenticeship system provided practical education, but also meant that children had little opportunity for formal schooling or leisure activities. Child labor was dangerous because children lacked the judgment and physical strength to safely perform many tasks. They were more vulnerable to accidents and injuries than adults, and they often worked in conditions that could affect their physical and mental development. The economic pressure to put children to work meant that many families had to choose between their children's immediate contribution to survival and their long-term educational and developmental needs. Most families chose immediate survival, perpetuating cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Chapter 5. The Merciless Midday. When the sun becomes your enemy. High noon. The daily reckoning. By the time the sun reaches its zenith in the Egyptian sky, the very air seems to shimmer with malevolent intent. This isn't just hot weather, this is heat with a personality disorder. Heat that seems to take personal offense at your continued existence and has decided to do something about it. The temperature has climbed relentlessly from the merely uncomfortable 90 degrees Fahrenheit of early morning to a brain-cooking 115 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, and the sun isn't finished with you yet. At midday in ancient Egypt, the sun transforms from a source of light and warmth into a cosmic weapon of mass destruction pointed directly at your head. The solar radiation is so intense that it creates its own weather patterns, heat mirages that make the ground appear to ripple like water, thermal updrafts that create dust devils and whirlwinds, and temperatures so extreme that the very stones beneath your feet become cooking surfaces capable of searing flesh. This is the time of day when sensible people, if such people existed in ancient Egypt, would seek shelter and wait for the sun to move on to torment someone else. But here's the cruel reality. In ancient Egypt, you couldn't always afford to be sensible. Sometimes you had to work through the heat, travel during the dangerous hours, or complete tasks that couldn't wait for cooler weather. Sometimes survival required you to face the sun at its most murderous and hope you were tough enough to survive. The encounter. The physics of suffering. Understanding Egyptian heat to truly comprehend what you're dealing with at midday in ancient Egypt, you need to understand that this isn't just about high temperatures. This is about the perfect storm of meteorological conditions that transform the Nile Valley into a natural convection oven designed to slowly roast anything foolish enough to venture outside. The desert surrounding the Nile Valley acts like a massive heat collector, absorbing solar radiation throughout the morning and then radiating that heat back into the atmosphere. The result is that by midday, You're not just dealing with direct sunlight, you're dealing with reflected heat from the ground, radiated heat from rocks and buildings, and superheated air that has been cooking over the desert for hours. The humidity from the Nile adds another layer of misery to the experience. While the desert itself is dry, the area immediately around the river maintains enough humidity to prevent your body's natural cooling systems, wetting, from working efficiently. Instead of evaporating quickly and cooling your skin, sweat tends to accumulate, creating a sticky layer of moisture that traps heat against your body. The stones and mud bricks that make up most Egyptian construction become thermal storage devices that absorb heat throughout the morning and then radiate it back for hours after the sun has moved on. By midday, walking barefoot on stone surfaces would be like strolling across a giant griddle. Even through sandals or crude shoes, the heat from the ground is intense enough to cause burns. The air itself becomes a tangible presence, thick, oppressive, and difficult to breathe. Each breath feels like inhaling from a furnace, and the superheated air actually provides no cooling relief for your overheated body. In fact, when air temperatures exceed body temperature, breathing actually adds heat to your system rather than cooling it. Seeking shade, the most precious real estate in the brutal heat of midday, shade becomes more valuable than gold, more precious than the finest linen, more sought after than the favor of the pharaoh himself. But shade in ancient Egypt was a limited commodity, and competition for it could become literally a matter of life and death. Trees were rare treasures in the Egyptian landscape. Date palms, sycamores, and tamarisks provided blessed relief when you could find them, but they were usually owned by someone who wasn't necessarily inclined to share. The shade of a large tree could accommodate several people, but there were always more people seeking relief than there was shade available. The social dynamics of shade-seeking were complex and often reflected the broader hierarchies of Egyptian society. Wealthy individuals or those with high social status could claim the best shade spots, while the poor had to make do with whatever scraps of shadow they could find. Sometimes people had to pay for access to shade, trading food, labor, or other valuables for the privilege of not dying of heat exposure. Buildings provided some relief, but most Egyptian structures were designed more for durability than for comfort. The thick mud brick walls did provide some insulation, but they also absorbed and stored heat throughout the day. By midday, even the interior of buildings could be uncomfortably hot, and the thick walls that kept buildings cool in the morning would later radiate stored heat well into the evening. The most sought-after shade was found in courtyards and areas where buildings created cross-vent. These spaces could be significantly cooler than the surrounding areas, but they were usually located in wealthy neighborhoods or temple complexes where access was restricted. The poor had to make do with whatever narrow strips of shadow they could find alongside buildings or walls. The architecture of survival. Building for the hit Egyptian architecture was fundamentally shaped by the need to create livable spaces in an environment that seemed designed to kill human beings. Every design decision, from the orientation of buildings to the thickness of walls, was influenced by the relentless heat that dominated Egyptian life. Wealthy households were built around courtyards that created microclimates within the harsh Egyptian environment. These courtyards were designed to trap cooler air during the night and early morning, then provide shaded spaces during the heat of the day. Water features like pools or fountains, when they could be afforded, added evaporative cooling that could reduce temperatures by several degrees. The thick walls of Egyptian buildings weren't just for structural strengths, they were thermal barriers designed to keep interior spaces cooler than the outside environment. These walls could be 2 feet thick or more, creating a buffer zone that slowed the transfer of heat from outside to inside. However, this thermal mass also meant that once a building heated up, it stayed hot for a long time. Windows were small and placed strategically to minimize heat gain while still providing light and ventilation. Many buildings had no windows at all on the sides that faced the afternoon sun, sacrificing light for thermal protection. The few windows that existed were often covered with reed mats or linen hangings that could block sunlight while still allowing some air circulation. Rooftop spaces were designed to take advantage of whatever breezes might be available, and to provide sleeping areas that were cooler than enclosed rooms. Many people spent hot afternoons and evenings on rooftops, though this exposed them to direct sunlight. During the day, the rooftops were often equipped with simple wind catchers or other devices designed to funnel any available breeze into the living spaces below. Water, the currency of survival. During the murderous heat of midday, water transformed from a basic necessity into a precious commodity that could literally determine who lived and who died. The human body's demand for water increases exponentially in extreme heat, and meeting that demand required careful planning and resource management that many people couldn't afford. The physiological reality of extreme heat is that your body begins producing sweat at rates that can quickly lead to dangerous dehydration. In temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, a person engaged in even light physical activity can lose over a gallon of water per hour through sweating. This means that staying hydrated in midday Egyptian heat required access to large quantities of water that many people simply didn't have. The water available to most ancient Ixiones was the same questionable Nile water they used for bathing and washing clothes. During the heat of midday, this water was often warm and contaminated with various biological hazards that made drinking it a risky proposition. However, the alternative, dehydration, was even more dangerous, so people had to drink whatever water they could obtain and hope for the best. Wealthy households might have access to cooler water stored in large ceramic jars or underground systems, but even this water was warmed by the ambient heat. There was no ice, no refrigeration, and no way to cool water below the temperature of the surrounding environment. The best you could hope for was water that was merely warm rather than scalding hot. Water conservation became an art form during the hottest parts of the day. People learned to drink slowly and frequently rather than consuming large quantities at once. They developed techniques for making limited water supplies last longer, such as holding small amounts of water in their mouths to provide some cooling before swallowing. The siesta, imperative, strategic shutdown. The concept of the midday siesta wasn't invented for leisure. It was a survival strategy developed by people who had learned that trying to remain active during the most dangerous heat could be fatal. From roughly 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., anyone with sense tried to minimize physical activity and find whatever shelter was available. This daily shutdown of activity wasn't a luxury available only to the wealthy. Even laborers and farmers learned to structure their work around the heat, completing as much as possible during the cooler morning hours and then seeking whatever relief they could find during the peak heat. Construction projects, agricultural work, and most other outdoor activities ground to a halt during the middle of the day. The siesta period was when Egyptian society briefly became more egalitarian. Rich and poor alike were united in their need to escape the heat, and social distinctions temporarily mattered less than the basic requirement of staying alive. Everyone was suffering together, and mutual aid during the heat became a community survival strategy. However, not everyone could afford to rest during the dangerous hours. Emergency work sometimes had to be done regardless of the heat. Sick people still needed care. Children and elderly people required constant attention to prevent death from heat exposure. Some occupations, like guarding valuable property or tending to essential services, couldn't be abandoned even when the heat became life-threatening. Heat-related illnesses, the silent killers. The extreme heat of midday Egypt produced a range of medical emergencies that ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand but learned to recognize and fear. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and severe dehydration were common causes of death, and the limited medical knowledge of the time made these conditions often fatal. Heat exhaustion typically began with excessive sweating, weakness, and nausea. Victims would become confused and disoriented, unable to make rational decisions about seeking shelter or conserving energy. Without proper treatment, which mostly meant cooling and rehydration, heat exhaustion could quickly progress to heat stroke. Heat stroke was often fatal in ancient Egypt because there was no effective way to rapidly cool an overheated body. Victims would stop sweating as their body's cooling systems shut down. Their skin would become hot and dry, and they would lose consciousness. Even if they survived the immediate crisis, heat stroke often caused permanent brain damage that left survivors unable to work or care for themselves. Dehydration was a constant threat that could develop quickly and progress rapidly to dangerous levels. The early signs, thirst, dry mouth, and reduced urination, were often ignored because they were so common in Egypt's climate. By the time more serious symptoms appeared, such as dizziness, confusion, and rapid heartbeat, the victim was already in serious danger. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable to heat-related illnesses because their bodies were less able to regulate temperature effectively. Pregnant women also faced increased risks because their bodies were already under stress. The mortality rate from heat-related causes was highest among these vulnerable populations. Working in the heat, when you have no choice despite the obvious dangers, some people had no choice but to continue working through the brutal midday heat. Farmers during harvest season couldn't afford to wait for cooler weather when their crops were ready to be collected. Construction workers on major projects were driven by deadlines that didn't accommodate the weather. Soldiers on campaign had to march and fight regardless of temperatures. People who had to work in extreme heat developed various survival strategies that helped them endure conditions that would quickly incapacitate or kill someone who wasn't prepared. These strategies were passed down through generations of workers who had learned to adapt to Egypt's harsh environment through trial and error. Work schedules were modified whenever possible to minimize exposure during the most dangerous hours. Tasks were broken down into shorter segments with frequent rest breaks. Workers learned to recognize the early signs of heat illness in themselves and their colleagues, and they developed buddy systems to watch out for each other's safety. Protective clothing became important for workers who couldn't avoid sun exposure. Loose, light-colored garments that covered as much skin as possible provided some protection against solar radiation. Head coverings were essential to prevent heat stroke, though most people couldn't afford elaborate sun hats and had to make do with simple linen wraps. Workers developed techniques for cooling themselves using whatever resources were available. Wet cloths applied to the head and neck could provide temporary relief. Seeking even brief moments of shade during work could help prevent dangerous overheating. Drinking small amounts of water frequently was more effective than consuming large quantities at once. The psychology of extreme heat living through the daily ordeal of midday heat in ancient Egypt wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a psychological test that affected every aspect of mental and emotional life. The constant stress of extreme heat exposure created psychological adaptations that shaped Egyptian culture and personality. Chronic heat stress made people irritable and prone to conflict. The physical discomfort and constant threat of heat-related illness created a state of perpetual low-level anxiety that affected decision-making and social interactions. Tempers flared more easily, and minor disputes could escalate quickly when everyone was suffering from heat stress. The daily cycle of extreme heat also created a form of learned helplessness. People knew that no matter what they did, they would have to endure several hours of dangerous heat every single day for their entire lives. This knowledge affected their psychology in profound ways, creating a fatalistic attitude that pervaded Egyptian culture. However, successfully surviving extreme heat also built psychological resilience and toughness that served people well in other aspects of life. Ancient Egyptians developed mental strategies for enduring physical discomfort, maintaining focus during stressful conditions, and working together to overcome environmental challenges. The shared experience of daily heat created strong community bonds. Everyone understood what everyone else was going through, and this mutual understanding created empathy and cooperation that helped entire communities survive. Heat became a unifying force that transcended social and economic divisions. Religious and cultural responses to extreme heat that dominated Egyptian life inevitably influenced religious beliefs and cultural practices. The sun god Ra was both revered and feared because his power was so obviously connected to the daily experience of heat and its potential for both life and death. Religious rituals often included prayers for protection from excessive heat and requests for cooling breezes. Temples were designed to provide refuge from the sun, and many religious ceremonies were scheduled for the cooler parts of the day. The religious calendar was influenced by seasonal variations in heat, with different festivals and observances timed to avoid the most dangerous periods. Cultural practices evolved to help people cope with extreme heat. Social customs discouraged unnecessary activity during the hottest hours. Community cooperation during heat emergencies became codified in cultural expectations about helping neighbors and sharing resources during crises. Art and literature from ancient Egypt frequently referenced heat and sun exposure as metaphors for suffering, endurance, and survival. The cultural mythology was filled with stories about heroes who overcame the challenges of the desert sun, reflecting the daily reality that every Egyptian faced. The heat economy. Commerce in extreme conditions. The extreme heat of midday Egypt created unique economic conditions that affected commerce, trade, and business practices throughout the civilization. Markets and trading activities were structured around the daily heat cycle, with the most active commerce occurring during the cooler morning and evening hours. Goods that provided relief from heat became valuable commodities. Fans made from reeds or feathers, cooling oils and unguents, and shade-providing structures commanded premium prices. Water sellers could charge higher rates. During the hottest parts of the day, when demand was highest and most desperate, the storage and transportation of goods had to account for extreme heat. Food spoiled quickly in high temperatures, so merchants had to carefully time their activities to minimize losses. Some goods, like certain medicines or cosmetics, became completely unusable if exposed to excessive heat. Labor costs varied with temperature conditions. Workers demanded higher compensation for jobs that required exposure to dangerous heat levels. Some types of work simply couldn't be performed during the hottest hours, creating bottlenecks in production and service delivery that affected the entire economy. Travelers and traders. Heat as a barrier to movement. Long-distance travel in ancient Egypt was largely determined by the need to avoid or minimize exposure to extreme heat. Caravans and trading expeditions had to be carefully planned around temperature conditions, and the heat created natural barriers that affected trade routes and commercial relationships. Desert travel was particularly dangerous because there was no escape from the sun's direct radiation. Travelers had to carry large quantities of water, which increased the weight of their loads and slowed their progress. Many trading expeditions were delayed or cancelled because of extreme heat conditions. River travel on the Nile was somewhat safer because water provided some cooling relief, but even boats and barges became uncomfortably hot during midday hours. Sailors and passengers had to find ways to create shade on vessels that were designed for cargo capacity rather than passenger comfort. The timing of travel became critical for survival. Most long-distance journeys were scheduled to begin before dawn and continue through the morning hours, with mandatory rest periods during the heat of midday. Evening travel was possible but required careful navigation in low-light conditions. Chapter 6. The Nile's Deadly Embrace. Living with ancient Egypt's most dangerous neighbors, the river of life and death. The afternoon heat begins to reach its crescendo and you find yourself desperately seeking any form of relief. Your thoughts inevitably turn back to the Nile, despite its role as the source of all life in Egypt, despite its sacred status in Egyptian religion, and despite the fact that your very survival depends on it. The Nile River was also home to some of the most terrifying predators on Earth, creatures that viewed humans not as the masters of civilization, but as convenient snacks. The ancient Egyptians had a complex relationship with their river's deadliest inhabitants. They worshipped them as gods, feared them as demons, and died from them with depressing regularity. Understanding how to coexist with these predators was literally a matter of life and death, and the knowledge was passed down through generations of people who had learned through bitter experience that the line between reverence and terror could be measured in seconds.